Hello, everybody. It is Wednesday, so DebateSensei is here back talking about another topic. We are talking about Parley today. Is the first Wednesday of the week. We got Tim CV from San Diego.
Bow, bow.
All right. I am Jared Kubica Miller, your debate coach, your professor of argumentation, and we have a guest joining us today on DebateSensei. Alex Lee is the Master's of International Affairs student at the School of Global Policy at UCSD. His areas of focus include on international politics centered around China, and is particularly interested in security and peace-related issues. He's got a lot of experience in debate as a coach at Oregon. It's an expert at parliamentary debate, did extremely well at the NPTE. Please welcome Alex Lee.
Hi, everybody.
Hello.
How's it going?
Thank you so much for joining us.
You weren't kidding about the intro.
Yeah, I know. Somehow every week we're able to make the same joke about how we nail the most important topic of all time.
And we haven't missed it yet.
Yeah.
We found what we thought was the most relevant, the most top of mind, hottest, freshest NPTE topic paper that turns out was last year's. But in any case, yeah. I'm glad to say we've got the author here. So Alex, thank you for putting that together. National Firearms Act, that is an issue that's been debated quite a bit. I understand that this did not end up becoming an NPTE topic last year, but hey, there's this year. You can always copy and pasta that in. I know that they're hurting for topics. It's still relevant. So where is it at this point? I mean, is there anything that you would amend to your topic paper? But I guess maybe even before that, taking a step back, what does the National Firearms Act tell us kind of where we're at with it as a topic, where it lands itself in debate?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of reasons why I wrote the topic paper. Mostly, I think gun control debates are like pretty boring, honestly. They're very samey, right? The debates are always pretty much the same. It's like gun control is good because people should stop dying, and gun control is bad because it's racist and like my freedoms. But I think the reason that I wrote that, number one, is I think we can get a little bit more granular in the way that gun control debates occur, right? So like specific policies, because if you get a topic that's gun control or the United States federal government should increase gun control, then that gives way too much ground to the affirmative and makes the negative pretty much the exact same debate every single time. So the NFA, I think it's, what is it in the topic paper, Internal Revenue Code 53 or something like that.
Yeah. I forget the number, but yeah, I believe that's what it was.
Yeah. It's the act that essentially bans machine guns, silencers, short barrel rifles, short barrel shotguns, and makes it a felony to own those without a tax stamp, which I think is interesting, because one of those things that people don't think about is like, oh, why can't you own a machine gun? It's not because you don't have the license to, it's because you don't have $25,000 kicking around, right? So it's one of those quirks in firearms law that I think is interesting to debate about. And I think that the direction of A, making it specific to this law, and then B, the direction of actually repealing it as opposed to like increasing it on the affirmative, or increasing gun control on the affirmative, I thought was an interesting way to take it. Now,
it doesn't really leave a whole lot of room for interpretation necessarily. You could focus on one at the exclusion of the others. Like if you wanted to have just a silencer debate, that would be interesting. But it also kind of prevents people from running away with it, right?
Yeah, that was one of the goals, right?
Yeah.
Because again, gun control debates are pretty samey. Because
And then you end up with some just really obnoxious picks about like, oh, sweet. So instead, we're only talking about collapsible stocks because this is exactly what we wanted to be discussing. Like, this is really going to solve, some. We're doing some terminal impacting here, but it doesn't really go all that far. So I like that this is also who doesn't like debating about tax code? So I think that's one of those avenues that ends up lending itself to some like very straightforward arguments that you can have on any gun control topic, but also some more inventive ones around like just the like classist way that the government regulates things, right? Where, okay, it's not going to be a jail time, it's going to be a fine, which just ends up becoming a fee if you make enough money. So those kinds of trade-off costs, I think, make for more interesting rounds, at least like directions that you can go with it. So I imagine that this version didn't find its way into tournaments, but when this topic has come up at tournaments, what are some of the more just like straightforward directions, maybe that you prep your high school students or that you prep some of your earlier college students on, just on the affirmative? All right, we're going to repeal this thing. What direction do you tend to start with?
So with repeal, I think there's a few different ways. One is you can go the process route where you argue things like politics. You get the classic like political capital debate, right? We pass this right-wing policy, we get like, climate change reform or some wacky arguments like that. The other ones, I think, especially in like gun control debates, are kind of critical framed. They don't necessarily need to be critical in the sense that, you're reading a full-blown K, but critical framed and like the kind of self-defense avenue is the avenue that I've seen the most strategic, right? So during COVID, like one of the like surprising statistics, and I guess this isn't really that surprising actually, was the spike in gun ownership among Asian Americans because of the increase in hate crimes, right? So like decreasing the barriers to ownership, because ostensibly the status quo is that people can have guns, right? Yeah. So decreasing the barriers to ownership for certain groups could be, they're good in some instances, particularly like that. Yeah. I think that's at least the affirmative for gun control debates more generally. As for the NFA, I don't remember what we were planning on reading on this. I think we were planning on reading actually a silencer at AF, where we just argued hearing damage is bad. Yeah. I think that was one of the arguments we were planning on reading. But yeah,
totally.
Yeah.
There's a decent volume of legislation.
I love doing those case-specific ones where, and even when you're given a really broad topic, you just kind of like package it really well around one of those particular issues, because I think the story just kind of gets lost when you're talking in these big general, like, because it's a big hodgepodge of different regulations in it from the sounds of it. And so giving it like some clarity, something that people can really hang on to by the end of rebuttals, happens by defining it around a particular, case in and of itself.
And I think something we've been talking about a lot lately is just the comparison of different weighing mechanisms, like as far as impact calculus goes, of like, this is probably not as high magnitude as we have solved gun deaths, like gun violence in America. However, like the probability of actually solving significant hearing loss is very high. Like, and you could also talk about like proximity. Like this is a real issue for lots of people. And so there exists, I think, quite a bit of legislation that I saw in the last couple of years for politicians trying to push for silencers, like just that one single piece, saying like this does not increase violence necessarily, but does decrease hearing loss. So I think that's an avenue that you may end up like tripping up some teams on the negative. They're like, wait a second, you're not banning everything? Like you're not just taking away my guns? And so I think that's kind of a clever direction that you can go with it that doesn't just go for like what's the most body count impact calc.
So you're talking about some critical affirmatives, but I was also thinking, like, especially when Tim is talking about how things are enforced using fees and fines, he seemed open to, well, it could be a critical affirmative, like a capitalist affirmative would seem to be like it would fit. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fact that the barrier to owning a machine gun is like
Yeah.
having $25,000 kicking around. I think that that's a little ridiculous. There definitely are Marxist-esque arguments. So I think that like the links, at least the topic links, are pretty good. Again, I like, well, not again, but I do think that like Mark's case obviously come down to the alternative. And that debate
Yep.
is like for each team to decide, but I think the topic links are pretty good. Does, you know, the act of repealing the NFA actually lead to a Marxist revolution? I'm not sure. I guess you get arguments about like the left being able to arm itself better.
Yeah.
But
We're one step closer to the revolution, if nothing
Yeah,
else.
Oh
yeah.
man, that'd be, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, like when you, yeah, I mean, like how you tell that story, though, I guess would be, yeah, it would be the difference between those. On a less critical level, then, what's the negative? Because I mean, like on specifically on silencers, like there's a lot of different ways that you can. I mean, the machine guns one, yeah, I don't think too many people are going for that. Where it's like we need more machine guns out there. It's what is the problem? Like we just need like a nest inside the kindergarten hall. You know what I mean? And it's like just scanning for anybody like that. When we talk about putting, arming teachers, that's what I mean. I want to put a battery in the playground.
It's a small
but
turret.
like, if you're going to have these, if you're going to have a silencer debate, if it's going to be, but these are all like a weird hodgepodge. Like, what's the negative do if you're going straight up? If you're not like necessarily doing a K.
So that is actually one of the reasons why you read it as a repeal the code as opposed to like repeal parts of the code. Because in repealing the NFA, you have to also allow for machine guns, right? So if the affirmative still wants to just go for, look, we solve hearing damage, the negative still gets access to, well, I don't care about hearing damage. You let people have machine guns. So I think that's probably still the most strategic negative on this topic. But as far as like the silencers argument, I'm not sure what the negative is to the silencers argument, which is why we wanted to read it.
Of course.
Yeah. But I suppose it would be just like solvency presses, right? Like, yeah, they're effective silencers, but like they don't all work that well, especially if you're putting them on bigger guns. Also, like, I don't know, silencers are probably classist. And I think that might probably solves
like,
by the app, but
you get to keep your hearing if you could afford it.
I think that you'd have a little bit of a difficult time, I think, setting up that harm story such a way that you can knock it down as well. It's like, okay, how many people actually lose their hearing or have significant damage? As I see a lot of stats around like the actual military, but that's not really solvable in this case, like since this is more of a policy that affects civilians. So you'd have to come up with stats that have to do with civilian hearing loss. And then of that group, how many would actually have access to silencers? I don't know that you'd really be able to solve that quite as cleanly. So that would be a bit of a trickier one.
But interestingly,
the
recent over-the-counter hearing aid change would probably solve the app.
Like, hey, thank you, Obamacare. Like, coming in for the rescue there. So one of the things I think that is always pretty interesting to me is like coming up with fun paternalism arguments of like, okay, is the IRS the right body to be regulating this thing anyways, right? So it's sure like the ATF is the one that's enforcing it, but when it comes down to it's a tax code, you can really come out with so many directions of like people get around tax regulations in lots of ways anyways. And also like lots of tax regulations are awful and we should be reforming them. So why is it that like this one gets some special treatment is like, well, now they get to be the moral police of like what is good and what's bad. So I think the mechanism in which this policy is done, I think leads itself to just much more economic arguments of like, what should the IRS be doing? Like what should be the limitations of, IRS jurisdiction? Like what policies should they be in charge of? Because this is really not ending up doing a lot of regulation. It's just saying like these things are not allowed because of tax purposes. So, or I think you can also be grandfathered in. So I understand, I have a friend that got tax stamps and was able to go through an attorney, and it's because I think some of his weapons were classified as antiques. So like an Uzi, for example, Uzis are no longer manufactured. They were made in like the 80s. But because they're fully automatic, but because they're no longer manufactured, they get some like interesting loophole. And so it's like, all right, there are still lots of ways that really dangerous guns make their way into this, sphere of things. Like the IRS is not really keeping people safer necessarily. They're just making it theoretically cost prohibitive, which is kind of one way, but it's not I guess it starts to feel effects topical to me of like, okay, you take this thing away, but that doesn't guarantee that you actually end up solving for these problems, right? Like it doesn't increase the number of people that can manufacture, M16s, like fully automatic things. So I think it comes into like some interesting tea ground maybe when you start talking about how the IRS is regulating something.
Yeah, I think, well, that might be an enforcement spec argument.
I suppose, I guess.
Yeah. But I'm not sure what the negative ground on that is, if not critical.
Yeah.
Because the problem is, it's like, you repeal this act. Does that actually substantively change how the IRS operates or how the ATF operates? I'm not entirely sure, but I definitely do think you get arguments on the negative about kind of shifting hands of who gets to say what in terms of rules. Now, like, does the ATF, because actually this might be an AF argument, because the ATF right now gets to define the rules based on the NFA. They get to say, this is an NFA item, this is not an NFA item,
Okay.
pretty much without oversight, right?
Okay.
And that's like led to contemporary debates about like, well, for one, bump stocks was a big thing until Trump banned them. Like there's a lot of debate now about pistol braces, which there's this weird loophole that was developed, like I think in early 2000s, regarding short-barreled rifles. Short-barreled rifles, so firearms under 16 inches, their barrels under 16 inches cannot have a stock, but you can have what's known, or I guess until recently, you could have had what's known as a pistol brace, which just is a stock, but built differently for a different purpose. And so the ATF for years was like, this is not a stock, you can have that. And then like recently they changed the rules and was like, this is a stock, you can no longer have this. So the jurisdictional question is like very, very intricate. Well, I guess not intricate in the sense that the ATF just gets to say this is what it is. So I think that the debates around it are intricate.
Right. Like, so that seems like it kind of just forces the affirmative into an actor that doesn't really have that much access to solvency, right? It's like, okay, you can do this thing, but it's really going to come down to, the ATF that sees through whether or not it actually happens, or it grants you any solvency there. So I think that's kind of a fun direction that you could go with it. In terms of like, so if we were to repeal more than just that, or like if the resolution was something like to change a component of the National Firearms Act, I feel like that's where you probably get into more of the traditional rounds that you would expect. Like more USFG should increase regulations around what, or decrease regulations on some particular thing. Where do you tend when you're, because I understand you did coach high school or still coach high school?
I coach high school public forum. I don't do Parley anymore. I did Parley last year.
Okay, nice.
Yeah, but
okay, cool. Well, so assume they get that topic. It's changes monthly. So if that comes up, one of the directions that you may prep your students in, are you just going to go after a bunch of different like weapon components, right? So like extended magazines and silencers and whatever, like bump stocks. Does it seem like in some of the rounds that you've judged, or some of the rounds you're prepping students, like those tend to actually get you further, or are those usually pretty quickly like delinked out of like, all right, this doesn't actually make a real change in public safety?
I tend to like smaller affirmatives. I tend to like specific arguments, right? Like talking about whatever rule about suppressors or silencers
Yeah.
or
Mhm.
short barrel guns. Like those would probably be the affirmatives that I tend towards, because I think those are framing debates, and I think framing debates are a lot easier to win than like machine guns are bad for public safety.
Yeah.
Like I think that that's probably a losing debate. So I think on the affirmative, it is, if you're going straight up, 99% of the time it's a framing debate, and I think that like those are debates that I'm probably more comfortable in. And to be honest, those were like the debates that, had this topic been chosen, we would have baited. So
Yeah.
yeah.
So we like using ChatGPT, especially when we start getting stumped on stuff like this. And I'm like, you know what? Let's see what they say. All right. And I think there is a little bit of wiggle room on the argument that comes up, which is that silencers make it hard for law enforcement to detect where gunfire is coming from.
Mhm.
And so and now you can start like linking that into like commissions of crimes and, being able to, determine the locations of that. Not only that, but there's like AI technology that certain departments are using to detect, like to triangulate where gunfire is coming from. And this might even throw that off,
Is
considering
that
that
a
they're investing.
shot spotter? I think, is that what
Yeah, is that what it's called?
I think so,
mean,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, like some larger cities, that's like microphones that are like sensitive microphones around the city that they're using to try and figure out exactly where gunfire occurs.
Yeah.
Which,
So
so that
it's the
already, I
beginning
feel like
of
you could just
something.
start ripping apart with a bunch of like, there's a lot of critical direction that you can go there for like,
Mhm.
okay, so now the government, law enforcement is listening, and where they're choosing to listen is certainly going to end up impacting where resources are allocated and like where policing or over policing is done. So do you have like just in your back pocket like some critical directions you tend to start going there? So I think you alluded to a couple in the topic paper of like historically gun control tends to be pretty racist, right? Where I am fairly ignorant to the subject, so like where's that link story fit in, and what do you tend to argue on that subject? Like what theories do you like that fit into that?
So I mean, aside from the intersection of class and race, which like definitely informs the way that tax law is written,
Yeah.
You make things. I guess this was the tax stamp was, $200 was a lot of money when the tax stamp was written, but not so much anymore.
Yeah, it was in like the
But
20s or something.
if you make it a fine, then that's clearly not just class based, but also like the federal government understands that like that is also race based. And so the intersection between class and race is definitely a route. The other thing is that like in the literature there are lots of arguments regarding the like specific attempts to take away firearm ownership from like specifically Black individuals. Um, I don't remember the author. I think Charles Cobb is the author of this book that I wrote, or not wrote. I read in preparation of writing this topic and debating things and debating this topic. It was This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. It's kind of this historical look at
Charles E. Cobb.
yeah. This historical look at like how gun control affected the Black community in the South. Specifically, I think it starts. I mean, it starts during slavery, before Black people could own guns, and then it traces after slavery through the civil rights movement and spends a lot of time in the civil rights movement, like talking about how not only there was like this culture of firearms that like allowed Black people to be able to defend their communities and like engage in community defense, but also like actively stopped violence against them. So I think that like there's a history there. Does that history extend into the modern day? That's another topic, probably in the sense that like you see communities attempting to arm themselves, not just like minorities racially, but also gender and sexual minorities also are like coming up and community or organizing in community defense. And so I think that those are also ways in which this topic could be more interesting critically.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I did not know at all historically, was like the NRA was still in support of, you know, gun ownership when the Black Panthers were really like heavily arming themselves. And I feel like the NRA has changed their tune in the last 60-ish years. But at least a lot of people could probably make a lot of arguments about where the NRA stands on race and class-based issues typically. But I think that tells a more, I don't know, nuanced historical story of like where gun control, like the powers that be, really like the multi-billion-dollar lobbies that end up realistically controlling gun legislation, where their dollars go and like where their support goes, like who they want to have guns. So I think that's maybe a direction that is kind of a fun one, is like, it really doesn't particularly matter what legislation is being put forth or who's going to be voting for it. It really just matters like who's up for re-election and has the NRA at their back. Like, because that tends to, you know, make it, I think you can go a little further down the political route. Jared, where was it that you said that ChatGPT was pulling out some different direction though? Was it just this topic in general that you fed it, and where?
It was this one I fed it. There was another one that was still on the silencers one. I kept reading down. It was also used by you have a poaching DA that you got to look out for.
Oh, okay.
Are used for illegal hunting. That's a really clever one. Like, and especially if you, I don't know, if you enjoy the sort of unique and small, intricate like arguments, like, oh man, like what's your response to poaching now? Huh? I love it. I was trying to, so I did feed it a little bit. It's like, all right, tell me why machine guns should be legalized. And it started off with prefaced, it was kind of like, listen, I got to clarify that machine guns are heavily regulated. All right. I'll provide you some arguments that have been used in debates, but it's important to note that these do not represent the views of myself or OpenAI.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, according to the OpenAI legal team, these views are not representative. Like, just want to make this really straightforward here.
That's amazing. I love how it's doing it. But it says that the difference between a machine gun and other guns is largely overblown. So it's like the media lies. We need to, use our Second Amendment rights. It's pretty generic stuff, really.
I suppose you can even say, like, in actual combat situations, like the military almost never uses a fully automatic setting, just because of like the ability to control a weapon that's firing at that rate is like almost non-existent. So like ARs, well, M16s, like the actual military use in warfighting situations is not used fully automatic. So I suppose you could probably say it's not quite as it's not quite as bad as it sounds, but I don't really want to be, I don't think I would advise any of my team members to use that in a round. But if you really needed some defense, there's that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, you could also say, like, you don't have the poaching disadvantage with that one. So there's that. Can you imagine trying to
I don't know. Like, I don't imagine that there's no rednecks that want to test that, of like, all right, let's see how it go for fares against this here Uzi.
Oh man.
Like, I think there's always going to be, your fringe cases, but I don't think I've ever heard a poaching impact in a debate round ever. So that's kind of a fun one. The Bambi design.
Yeah. I like that one. Like, you should try to get other people to run the silencer app just so you can run the poaching DA. Man.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. What else was I? So before I was wondering if you wanted on the neg, you're like, no, I don't want to repeal it. Let's actually like enforce it without the IRS. So do you think that would be a legit counterplan? Because my first instinct is no. That you're like, hey, okay, IRS, it's no longer a fine. Now it's a crime. It's not a tax. It's not a tax thing anymore. So we're going to keep the NFA, but we're going to make it a crime rather than a tax, fine.
I think if the AF is critical about the IRS, then like probably. Yeah. But otherwise, I agree. I don't think there's any great solvency differential you get. I mean, that's functionally like you ban the plan, right? Because you you keep the NFA.
Yeah,
you
I know. That's why. Yeah.
But yeah, I don't think there's anything unique about that except for answers to some critical positions. Yeah.
Well, I suppose you can. So one of the I heard a really kind of clever plan come out a little while ago that was like ban guns for everyone except like under a certain income threshold, non-white men. So it's like basically white men over a certain income threshold, that's who guns are unequivocally banned for. And then they're like, okay, this is what the actual statistical outcome would be for mass shootings. And it was like, oh shit, that's a 90% reduction. Get out. Like, okay, if we're really just talking numbers here, it's meant to be a little bit ludicrous, but also like it points out a really serious thing of like, it's not women committing crimes. Like mass shootings are not done by women. Were women the ones that were passing this legislation? Where the roles were reversed basically, and like 99% of violent gun deaths were performed by women. 100% that policy would be passed right away on gender lines. Like that men would be like, oh no, like ladies just can't be trusted with guns. But because that's not the current structure of our legal system, it's like, well, we're just going to ignore all of those things, and it's mental health thing, but we're also not going to require registration. So I think there are some like almost humorous plans that can be brought up, like, all right, we're going to say this ironically, but it proves a greater critical point of where violence is really being done. I think there might lie some kind of fun net ground there.
All right, hey everybody, that's our time for this week. Alex, I really want to thank you for coming by. I would love to do it again if you're up for it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
All right, excellent. So it's Tim, Jared. We'll be seeing you next week with another topic of all time. All right, bye.
Thank you.